Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you might be around the world. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Eric Neiberg, and I'll be your host today. And I'd like to welcome Chad Beier, who is our accredited professional Scrum trainer on the call today, who's going to help hopefully answer some of your questions. He's going to focus around what is my product and looking at product owner type questions, but also how the Scrum Master and the Scrum team work around the product and the product owner. If we can go to the next slide, Chad. So what is this series? It's a series that gives you the opportunity to ask an expert, gives you the opportunity to get that feedback, to ask those pressing questions and hopefully get help. Maybe we can call it a little bit of mentoring toward continuing on your goal. Next slide. So just briefly, who is Scrum.org? For those of you not familiar, we are the home of Scrum, and we are the certifying body around Scrum, including training, of which Chad is one of our trainers around the world, and assessments. And we also continue to build out content to help you learn. This is all about continued learning and continued education. It is never done. It is never complete. And make sure to check out our website and look for all of the resources that are free out there and available to help you with your continued learning, whether it's the guides or the training or webinars like this and videos and so on. Chad, next slide. And this is just a brief overview of the different training classes that we have, our Scrum Master and Advanced Scrum Master Foundations, Introduction to Scrum, Product Ownership, and so on, all the way through to how do we do things together as teams, like working Scrum with Kanban and bringing those concepts together, not changing Scrum, but how do we add additional practices and things to help be more successful. Next slide. So before Chad introduces himself, I just want to make sure, and then I'll hand it off to him. On the left hand, or on the lower box within this GoToWebinar panel, you'll see your opportunity to ask questions. Please make sure to enter your questions, provide them, and we'll be going through those for Chad to start to answer. Oh, there it is, the quick guidelines. So to start asking your questions. And I'll help moderate those questions and bring them out to Chad. So start asking them. I'm sure you've got lots in your mind. And with that, I'll hand it over to Chad to introduce himself.
Awesome. So I'm going to go back a slide here to there we go. So my name is Chad Beier. I'm an organizational agility advisor. I started my own company a few years ago now, or I guess a year, maybe less than 2 years ago. Whiteboard Consulting. And I'm hopefully going to be able to use the whiteboard a bit today. We're going to see if the technology cooperates with us. But I've got an iPad all set up, so if I don't have something to draw on, it's like kryptonite for Superman. I lose all my powers. So, but anyway, my background. I started out in web development, did some programming there. Some Java programming after that, and that bled into stepping away from the technical realm into a business analysis role. That led into a project management role, and like I usually say in my intros, I had some dark days of my career, I guess, in project management. That's a separate story for another day, but what happened was it led me back to Scrum, which my first experience with Scrum was actually back in 2005. It led me back to Scrum, and I kind of reignited my passion for Scrum, and left the project management role, entered a consulting role, the wonderful world of consulting, and here I am years later now, Scrum.org trainer and coach and advisor. So that's, I don't want to get too long-winded, but I want to give people a background on kind of where I came from. So as you're asking questions, you kind of have a backdrop for where I've been and what I've seen over the years, I guess. So You can reach out to me. I don't like social media really beyond LinkedIn. So LinkedIn is great if you're interested in continuing conversations after this. And you can find me at chadbeier.com or whiteboardconsulting.org. So, okay. Already felt long-winded.
Awesome. Thanks, Chad. And like I said, it's just your microphones are muted, but please bring on the questions. Ask them in that little box, as you can see there, and we will take those questions. So let's get started. And you just talked a little bit about your prior role as a product manager. So first question is, what's the difference between a product manager and a product owner?
Good question. So, and what I specified was I was actually project manager. So I wasn't a product manager, but let's unpack that question. So a product owner versus a product manager. A product manager, I'm actually teaching a product owner course this week. Product management is something that doesn't go away in Scrum. And it's actually a large majority of what a product owner has to do in managing a product and managing a product backlog. So the product owner role is what we assign in the role in Scrum, and the product owner spends a significant amount of their time, a good amount of their time interacting with the Scrum team, which is the Scrum Master and the development team, in addition to themselves. But outside of the Scrum events, and there's a lot of work to do in managing a product. So the real difference is beyond just the cadence that the sprint and Scrum brings. The product manager is reaching out with stakeholders, customers. It could be focus groups. It could be evaluating releases after they've gone live. So there's a lot of work, and then just in general, keeping tabs on what the market is doing and for the product you're trying to bring to life. So that's kind of a high level breakdown of the product owner versus product manager. And again, like the PSPO course that we have really covers a lot of that differentiation and beyond the Scrum team focus on product management.
So I think tied to that question, Chad, is where does business analysis fit, right? A product manager often does a lot of that business analysis role, and often in an ISV, that role might be called product manager, and in an IT organization, it might even be called a business analyst. Where does business analysis fit? Is it still done in Scrum?
Yeah, I get this question a lot. I speak at a lot of PMI conferences and business analyst conferences. I actually was at the BBC conference in San Antonio in November. This question comes up a lot. If I'm in business analysis, if I'm a business analyst as a role or a job title, where do I fit in Scrum? And it's a big question to unpack because there's a lot of nuance around the context. So we'll make some assumptions, but let's say if we're talking about a traditional business analysis role from like an IT business analyst, where in a waterfall approach or traditional system development lifecycle approach, that business analyst served as that liaison role between, I'm going to use words that I don't like, the business and IT, right? And they were this bridge to take requirements and put them into a requirements specification or document and then hand them off to the IT department to deliver. I'm not advising this. I'm just setting up the rest of this answer. So from that perspective, the analysis is good. How we did analysis in the past is where things always continually fell apart. So when you are taking all those big batch requirements and putting them into a locked-in scope document that sometimes gets put on the shelf for months to years, and then you pick that back up, there's all that extracting of the rich conversations that you didn't have when you're rehashing those to go build the solution. And this is why we get solutions that we didn't want at the end of long cycle projects. So the alternative, though, it's not that analysis is bad. It's not that business analysis is bad, requirements analysis, requirements gathering. We have to clarify what it is we want, what it is we think we want to build, and why we want to build it. So the skill set of business analysis definitely exists. Who does it, how you do it, when you do it is what changes when you're in a Scrum context. So, for example, you've shrunk that batch cycle, essentially that time frame, because you're working in small 1 month or less iterations. So that allows you to then focus those rich analysis conversations on the requirements that you're going to be delivering weeks later, if not days later. And so what we really want to focus on in analysis is that we're not going too far forward into the future where we've created waste inventory, right? Where we have requirements that inevitably are going to change that we've set on the shelf to collect dust. So what happens is we shift, we need that skill set. Business analysis roles can definitely help fill that. Product owners can fill some of that on their own. And then dev team members can spend time refining the backlog with the product owner as well and refining that. So there's no one right answer there. But what we're trying to avoid is big batch requirements. What we don't want to do is have product backlog refinement in Scrum become a phase of its own, because then we slip back into big upfront planning in a world that is changing faster than it ever has before, in 2018, 2019 almost. So, okay, I'm going to stop there and see where we're at. I don't know if we're getting any feedback on these questions or.
Yeah, we are, Chad, and this is good, and more continue to come in, which is what I'd expect. As you start talking, people are thinking about more things and so on. So a question about architectures kind of goes a little bit away from product ownership, but certainly tying things together. How do you handle architectures in Scrum, especially if there's an architect or architecture is shared across multiple Scrum teams?
Yeah. So that's interesting because we've already introduced the concept of sharing across multiple Scrum teams. So I might go to the whiteboard for this one and just talk through this. So let's say we are talking about multiple Scrum teams. There's some scaling fundamentals that I'm just going to introduce briefly for this conversation. So let's just say at the top of the screen here, there'll be a little delay, but there it is. You should be able to see it. There's a product backlog. And we have one product backlog per product definition, which we haven't dived into how you define your product yet, but I think we'll get there before the hour's up. And then you're typically, let's say you said multiple Scrum teams. So there's multiple development teams underneath this product backlog. Let's say 4. So we have 4 teams. And I'm not going to dive into whether these are cross-functional teams or whether these are feature teams or component teams yet, but let's hope that they're cross-functional teams, meaning they have all the skills needed to turn something from that product backlog into working, potentially releasable product at the end of every iteration, every sprint. So we have 4 teams underneath here. Architecture aside, just staying synchronized on dependencies across this product is one task at hand. And so if we're talking about architecture, I'm going to make an assumption that we're likely in at least some shared code bases. So let's just say that these 2 teams share a technology stack, and that's one code base. And then let's make it somewhat complicated. We'll say then this other team has their own code base, and this team has their own code base. Again, I'm not advising that this is the absolute way to go, and we don't want to open up code ownership to the entire ecosystem, but let's say this is your scenario. So we have a few things going on. The teams on the left side of your screen here that share that code base, they're going to have to stay synchronized. And ideally, they just stay synchronized all the time, every day, every sprint. And if you drift away from staying synchronized, then you're going to have a lot of integration work to do down the road, and that's just kicking risk down the road. On the teams that don't share that code base, you still have to stay synchronized if the assumption is that this is one product, right? So all of this rolls up to this one product backlog that we're defining the vision and roadmap for where we want to go for this product. So so architecture then sort of lives within each team potentially, and maybe surrounding each team. You know, in your simplest startup company, one team Scrum, architecture isn't going to be a role. You're just going to practice good architecture practices as a development team. If you're in a scenario where you have defined architects, what you want to try to avoid is handoffs between an architecture team and your development teams underneath your product backlog. So to avoid those handoffs, you've got a few options, probably more than a few, more than I'll share here. But you could have an architect skill set that's shared across the teams, and maybe they take on a traveling teacher mindset where they spend time with the teams talking through potential architecture paths, and it emerges as the product backlog is consumed each sprint. Or you might just embed that inside of your Scrum teams right from the start. The dev team members may just have a lot of architecture background and skill sets, and they do some experimentation sprint after sprint. They try something, maybe they have to change course. But ultimately, you know, it's a loaded, all these questions are going to be hard to answer without the specific nuance of the context. But hopefully that helps paint somewhat of a picture of what that might look like. The key takeaway that I try to stress here is that if you have one product backlog and one product, you need to take architecture into account for that product ecosystem, that product. If you start to locally optimize the architecture for one area, again, you might drift apart on the entire product solution, and that's where we have things like bugs that creep up months down the road because an interface between some data feeds wasn't defined properly because we didn't architect the systems properly to talk to each other. So things like that creep up. Yeah, you know, one story I'll share, I guess, from a team I interacted with in the past. You might not have this luxury if you're in a legacy code environment, but if you have the luxury of using relatively new tech tools, I'm thinking maybe Amazon Web Services, cloud services, things. I've seen teams using Lambda and functions and things like that. If you have that luxury, the real shift in mindset, in my opinion, is shifting from architecture up front and trying to get architecture, quote unquote, right at the beginning of any iteration or any effort or any project, if you're still calling things projects, and shifting to a mindset of letting that architecture emerge. And I mean, this isn't my idea or new idea. Emergent architecture is, I think, a pretty ubiquitous phrase at this point around the world. But it's really being comfortable with not having it right, again, quote unquote, right out of the gates. Because how do we know if it's right or wrong? The only way to know that is to try it and validate it and test it. And if it doesn't work well, shift direction. So I'd say this is synonymous with the exact same mindset of refactoring code. We should look at refactoring code as just part of product and software development, not as like a bad thing because we didn't do it right the first time. We're in a complex space, so this isn't about doing things right the first time. It's about inspecting, adapting, and learning as we go so that we can improve things from a quality standpoint forward. So architecture is, you know, right at the forefront of that conversation.
So it looks like the original person who asked that question, Chad, has a follow-on question. Or it might be a comment. I'm not quite sure how to take this one, but I'll put it out to you. We have 3 teams and 1 architect. When the team develops a feature, they then send it to the architect for code review, which normally takes half a day to respond from the architect. And then that endangers, of course, the sprint goal. Do you have suggestions around ideas around that? Now, why we would have 1 architect doing all code review is a different question, but if you want to take that one.
Yeah. So I'll reiterate what I said a bit earlier in the conversation, but I'll highlight it for you. That traveling teacher mindset that I said, what that means is if we can get away from having a single person or single architecture team sign off on things, that's going to remove that impediment to agility. In more general terms, specialization is the enemy of agility. I like to say that a lot. Feels like I made it up on my own, but I think I probably stole it from many other people over the years. But I'll say it one more time. Specialization is the enemy of agility. What I mean by that is if you have a specialist team, a specialist skill, a specialist role that you rely on, and you take something your team has done and you have to hand it off to another team, that's a form of waste in an organization from a lean thinking standpoint, but that's also just something that's going to slow you down. And so the question is, what do you want to optimize for? If you truly want to optimize for agility, which I defined as effectively responding and effectively adapting to the world around you, then you have to look at, is there a way we can distribute that skill set into the team, across the teams? And so that traveling teacher mindset that I brought up earlier is one tactic you can take, where the architect carves out some time, maybe each sprint for you, to work through those reviews, maybe on a cadence, so that it's not a send it over, wait for the approval, and come back. What that will do is promote some learning across the teams, so they become architects themselves, and they can put some of these things in place without an approval process in place.
Cool.
I'll stop
there. I think that was great in starting to look at what is the right thing to do, and how do you distribute. I think this is exactly what you're saying, right? Is how do you distribute responsibility across the team and not have it all fall on one? There's lots of great concepts in agility and in agile practices along pair programming and mobbing and lots of things to get that code review to happen without requiring that one single person. That's actually could add to even additional errors, because now you've got that single point of failure as well.
Yeah. Yep.
Cool. So going down a little bit of a different path, but I think certainly tied into the conversations we've been having so far. Do you have any recommendations for backlog refinement in prioritization, especially for a smaller team? And then a follow-on question to that is, how would that be handled within multiple products and different stakeholders for those products? But let's focus on the first question, I think, first, probably.
Okay, so was it just tips for product backlog refinement?
Yeah, tips for backlog refinement and prioritization is part of that refinement.
Sure. Yeah, so I guess one tip, let's get ourselves a product backlog. We can't have a product backlog refinement conversation if we don't have a nice. The number of times in a day or week that I draw this sloppy little product backlog is ridiculous. So here's a product backlog. We have some product backlog items on our list. I guess I'll highlight this. I just got done covering this with the PO course, product owner course that I'm in. The refinement is explicitly listed as an activity. Well, maybe it's not explicit, but it's listed as an activity in the Scrum Guide if you take a look at that. Refinement is not an event in Scrum. It's not one of the 5 events. That's because refinement happens in all types of scenarios. Refinement might be a product owner sitting at their desk making an ordering decision. It might be a product owner on the phone with a customer. It might be a product owner on the phone with a subject matter expert. It might be the product owner sitting in a refinement session with the dev team, breaking large product backlog items down. It might be the dev team looking at the items and giving them some sort of estimate if they're estimating their items. So that the reason refinement is called an activity is because there is no one right way how to do it. It depends on your context and what works for each team and ecosystem. So, but some guidelines. Again, some of this stuff is just from the Scrum Guide. You can look this up on your own. I highly recommend rereading the Scrum Guide often. I always make a joke with people that I keep it underneath my pillow, and every day I wake up and read the Scrum Guide. It's not true, but every time I do read that Scrum Guide, it's amazing what pops out at you that you realize, wait, has that been there for years? And sure enough, it has. So always worth a reread. But some guidelines: up to 10% of the dev team capacity, one guideline. Another guideline, and again, that's up to 10%. It doesn't mean you should strive for that. It just means if you're doing more than that, there's a likelihood that you might be going too far forward. So that's what I'm about to draw here. Let's say that on average, we've been getting 2 PBIs done a sprint for this simple example. I'm not going to intersize it here. So let's say this is sprint 1 and this is sprint 2. So you can see we got 2 items done. We normally get it around 2 items. So we're doing a little forecasting here in our backlog. And so these on the right side here, I'm just indicating that I'm looking forward down my backlog about 1-2 sprints. Now, again, not a hard rule, but you can, if you do that and you try to get the top of your product backlog in good shape, and good shape means you have some clarity on what it looks like when it's done. You have some acceptance criteria clarity. And that's just essentially, testing, acceptance criteria, requirements. They're all one and the same. So do you understand what you're trying, what's being asked for? Again, you might have a size component to it. You might have some of those items broken down because they might not fit within one sprint, so you've sliced them up. Those are refinement activities that you might do to get the top of the backlog in order. Another big one is scanning down the backlog for dependencies. So if you do have teams that you rely on outside your team, it's on the dev team to scan down that backlog and look for those dependencies that will become like impediments inside your sprint at some point in the future. If you can do whatever you can to reduce those, that's going to help you out when you're in your sprint. So that's huge. That's something that, when I spin up new Scrum teams and help organizations get started with Scrum, that's something that it comes up all the time. Like this idea that it is on the Scrum team, the dev team really, to be scanning down that backlog, looking for things that they need to coordinate with outside teams. This is why I sometimes remind dev team members, inside training and outside training, that there is no project manager role in Scrum. And that just means that the things that project managers did that actually were kind of nice maybe in the past, like would go out to other teams and coordinate dependencies, well, we have to do that now. And if we do that, we're going to be closer to the conversation. We're going to have a richer conversation. And then we might be able to slowly bring some of those skills into our team, like I talked about with that architecture specialist team. So those are some highlights of product backlog refinement for me. I'll close it with this. The other thing that you can do, because this isn't just a right or wrong answer, you will know intuitively, gut feel, if you are doing enough or too little of product backlog refinement, based on how sprint planning goes. So try to use sprint planning as your kind of gauge. If sprint planning is really painful, it seems like you're thrashing, you don't really understand the product backlog items being presented, or you always feel like you have to pull all these other people into sprint planning to get clarity, it probably means you're not refining your backlog enough looking forward for subsequent sprints. So what happens then is you end up doing refinement activities heavily in the first part of sprint planning, and then you run out of time box because you're like, well, how do we run out of time for sprint planning? It's because you were actually doing all this refinement, getting things in shape. So you'll know if sprint planning starts to feel like, oh, we've seen these things before, let's pull some items in, and then we'll start to task them out towards the end of sprint planning, then you're probably doing a good amount of refinement.
Great. Thanks, Chad. So do you have any recommendations for organizations that are calling out services as multiple products? So every service is its own product. Any thoughts or
Calling,
comments there?
Yeah, so it depends on what we mean by services. So I'll just talk through some assumptions. A product, when I use the word product, I include product, service. Product and service are anonymous. Let's use new verbiage. How about business capability or just capability? What is it that you're providing to teams inside the organization, potentially, and what value are you bringing? So I guess advice on if you're narrowly defining your product on services within the organization, or even if it's outside the organization, their services, it might be legitimate to call them products. But I guess I'd look at who is your customer. Try to pinpoint who is your customer, and if your customer is not like the outside of the organization consumer, then you're leaning more towards a narrow product definition, and that will have side effects on how Scrum is going for you, because Scrum assumes that we have a product definition and ideally a broad product definition that is something that we would actually sell. So it's hard to answer these questions without a lot of context, but if you are internal, here's one test I like to challenge sometimes, infrastructure teams that provide a service to app dev teams inside of their own organization. Imagine that if you tomorrow were carved out as your own company, your own, whatever your service is that you offer, and you were across the street, got your own building, your own office space, and you were going to sell that service. Ask yourself, honestly, would your organization pay for it? Would other organizations pay for it? And that might give you an indication on whether you have a real product, or if you are just a team within a chain of teams handing work off to each other to ultimately deliver a capability. So that's one question you can ask yourself. Without context of like what kind of service offering we're talking about, I'm probably going to stop there because I could just keep going on assumptions.
Great. Here he's come back. I'm saying, sorry, different question. Thought he came back with a comment there. So you've been doing a lot of consulting and certainly contract work in the past. Do you have any suggestions on how to deal with contracts for Scrum projects? Often the client wants a traditional management practices, and they certainly want to know, I'm going to pay for this, and you're going to deliver that. How do you deal with those situations as a consultant?
Yep. So the root of the question. I'll cut to the chase. What I said earlier about impeding agility, specialization. If you are outsourcing, if you are hiring someone to deliver something for you, and if it has a certain amount of scope that you've asked for, you have outsourced some of your agility. I mean, that's what you're doing. You're making a cognizant, maybe it's not that cognizant, but the organization, whoever made the decision to contract someone else to come in and build something for you, you have outsourced some of your agility, your control over how agile you can be. Now, if you hire a great company that is actually delivering things and doing really solid Scrum, that's great. Most of the time what happens is somebody says that they're using Scrum, they say they're sprinting, but the verbiage is all weird and they really aren't delivering a working product increment at the end of every sprint. and then your agility is impeded, and it's kind of a nightmare situation. Most of the situations I walk into. So here's what I would advise on that. If you have the luxury of the contract is not signed yet, or the relationship with the entity is good enough that you could approach changing the contract. I don't want to give you one method here, but maybe start that conversation and see if you can shift it away from upfront planning, fixed scope deliverables by a certain date, and change it more to a time and materials with some shared risk across both entities, so that you can basically validate, can you deliver a working product increment to us on a cadence? And if you can't, then you should part ways and find someone who can. Now that's a tough task, because I think there are still way too many vendors and companies out there that are signing up for these fixed scope, fixed date contracts, knowing that they won't hit them, padding them as to account for that risk. But at the end of the day, we're all still unhappy on both sides when it ends inevitably the way we know it will, but we just keep ignoring the writing on the wall. So I have a dream that someday I'm hoping we can make a massive shift where we stop the madness of signing these fixed scope, fixed date contracts, and we really start truly partnering, like having strategic relationships across client and customer, and building things effectively together.
And together doing the important.
Other I direct you to is I'm heavily influenced by Craig Larman and Boss Voddie's work on the large scale Scrum and just anything that they've written about in their books. But Craig makes a freely available, you can download an entire excerpt from his book, his chapter on Agile Contracts. It's called Agile Contracts Primer. I think if you Google it, Agile Contracts Primer, I believe is what it is. You'll probably hit the link. That's free. I mean, he makes it free, and it was written by Craig, who has decades of experience in consulting Scrum adoptions, large-scale Scrum adoptions, and a lawyer who understands Agile really well. So it's good information, and again, it's not a cookie cutter, do this and it'll work for you, but it's definitely material that I would direct people towards when they're talking about this question.
Great, and I mean, I've experienced this on both sides of it as well. We built a product where we contracted out, and what we did is we contracted out by sprint, rather than saying, "Oh, here's what you're going to deliver." Of course, there were some deliverables within that and so on, but it was really a contracting out by sprints. We purchased a number of sprints with a sprint out clause in there, and that was to protect both sides so that we weren't just canceling on day 30 of the sprint, and there were buyouts and those sorts of things, but it allowed us to really work together as a team. Product ownership was retained by the client, so that true ownership lived. And in this case, we actually even had some development team members on the Scrum team. So development team members lived across. So we had some at the client level and some at the consultant or contract level. And what this allowed us to do is transfer over time that knowledge so that the product could be taken over by the customer in the end. And what was great is that built a real relationship rather than you're going to deliver this, and it also built the transparency. As we all know, what often happens when we do this contract type work is everything goes into a black hole, and then all of a sudden it appears at the end. What it really helped us do is build those things together and deliver together. What we found is super critical were the Scrum values, and really respecting across the team, transparency across the team, and truly working together as a team.
And I think that I'll loop this back to our topic for the day too. I mean, what's my product? Just because you've contracted and you've got two legal entities working together, it doesn't change what your product is. And I think that's, at the root of a lot of these conversations. The game changer in Scrum, I say this so much, the game changer in Scrum is that we have a working product increment on a cadence. I mean, iterative and incremental development, those buzzwords. The sprint is your iteration. The increment is your incremental delivery. That is the game changer. And if you have your product defined in a way too narrowly, maybe across entities where you don't work collaboratively together, you don't have trust and respect for each other, then it all falls apart, right? And so that's why people sometimes will struggle with Scrum, and they'll say that we're a unique snowflake, our organization is different, Scrum doesn't work for us. Well, that's not, I mean, they might be a unique snowflake. That's true. Every organization is different, but Scrum will work. You just got to make some of those hard trade-offs and decisions and kind of zoom out at the organizational level and ask yourself, what is it that we're actually trying to deliver here? What's our product or service? So I'll let you throw me another question, and then if it's aligned, I'll try to. What I wanted to make sure by the end of the hour is I wanted to try to teach my process that I do, whether it's on day one with a sales touch point with a new client potentially, or whether it's later on. I draw this on the whiteboard very often, basically rationalizing demand and delivery to kind of surface for your organization or your department, like where should our product definition live? But I'll let you throw some more questions at me.
Great. I think this is kind of tied to it, and certainly tied to some of the other questions that have come in. What if we don't sell a product externally, but we sell a service that is made up of multiple systems, maybe even excess of 20? How do you think about defining products? I think this comes back to certainly that question earlier about services, but I think it's a broader question, which is, how do you define a product?
Yeah. Great. So that's perfect. I'm just going to dive into this. So anyone can do this. So I hope someday someone draws this and I'm like, oh, that came from this webinar. So I usually start by drawing a horizontal line across the whiteboard, and on the top I write demand. Sorry, that's really sloppy. Trying not to advance the slide by touching the screen too much. And on the bottom, I write delivery. Rationalizing demand and delivery. So then I start a line of questioning with whatever ecosystem I'm in, and I start asking about, okay, where does all the work come from today? Or like what are what we call our backlogs? And maybe we don't even have backlogs started yet, but just where does our work come from? And so what you start to unfold in the conversation is these lists, and I don't call them product backlogs yet to confuse the Scrum terminology. I just call them lists. These are just things of work. They're demand streams. And if we wanted to be realistic, there's probably some funnel up here where all the stuff comes from that maybe is driven by strategic objectives for the organization. But we have all these lists in our organization, and this is, could be even departments across our organization. But then I start to ask some questions about those lists. So if you asked your customer, would they call one of those lists a product? If the answer is no, then I ask deeper, maybe, well, what would they call a product? So one easy example is, I've worked with a lot of insurance companies over the years, so I'll pull from some of my past here. Let's say these product backlogs, or these lists that we came up with were for insurance. So let's say there's a claims area. Let's say there's an enrollment area. And if anyone on my current, if anyone who's my current client is on the call, I'm not talking about you, but you might think so because it's insurance. So claims, enrollment, and let's say we have, what else do we have? We have billing. Okay, so we've got these different levels of lists where stuff comes from. And let's say today we're actually structured that way, where we've got a team that works on the claims work, and a team that works on the enrollment work, and then a team that works on the billing work. Now, again, a customer wouldn't say, oh, I'm going to buy billing from you. I mean, actually, if that could be a situation if you were selling billing services, but in this situation, you're not. It's just part of insurance. You don't buy claims processing, right? You buy insurance, and claims processing is just part of the capabilities that product unlocks for you. So once you have your current ecosystem defined, you have where the work's coming from, and you've got the bottom half of like how your teams are currently structured. Then I start to bring in the technology component. And this is where I'm asking questions about how coupled is your technology stack, your code bases, your architecture. Is there tight coupling? And if that language isn't appropriate for the audience, then ask it this way. How often, if I need to modify something for the claims work, does it impact enrollment or billing, right? Do we step on each other's toes a lot? So let's say in this scenario that we do. So I just draw that to represent that there's one code base or there's tight coupling across those lists. So this is an opportunity then to open up an interesting conversation. There's an illusion that we have a product in claims and an illusion that we have a product in enrollment, because what's really going on is behind the scenes, no matter what, if something is asked for in enrollment, it hits the same area. Oh, and by the way, the same people, right? Underneath that tech stack, there's people down there on those teams working on this. Look at those sloppy stick people that I drew. And so there's tight coupling there. So what we want to do, this is the rationalizing. This isn't the right answer, but it may be a starting point for getting closer to a broad product definition, is rationalizing your demand today and your delivery today into something typically involving collapsing lists into one product definition. So in this example, what if I were to just ask some more questions like, well, what about claims, enrollment, and billing? Like, is that, who cares about that? And it might be our group insurance policy holders. Great. So maybe our product is just group insurance. And we might form a backlog for that. So let's say I'll just draw a dotted line over here. And on the right side here, I'm going to just talk about future state. So what if we had a backlog for group insurance? And then we have to find out also that this organization, they also do individual insurance policies. And we find out that their code base over the years actually is all mixed together for those, but it's been a nightmare for them to maintain. And they actually been thinking about for years now of carving it out and like basically taking a duplicate code base and breaking the tight coupling so that they would have separate code bases. So let's say they're willing to do that. Now we have two product definitions, group insurance, individual insurance. And our tech has been split so we don't have the dependencies and tight coupling. That sets us up for agility. And now what do we do with our teams? Because I don't think our existing teams are really equipped, at least in their current structure, to deliver against this. So this story I'm telling you actually gave me an awesome opportunity to facilitate a self-organization activity. And we took the entire IT department, we got in a room, and less than 2 hours later, we had the team self-organize into cross-functional Scrum teams. So at the end of it, we actually had 2 teams under the group side and 2 teams under the individual side. Looked something like that. Now, on day 1, is it hard to bring a product backlog item to completion within a sprint? Of course, because our skill set has not been shared across the teams yet. So what we tried to do when the team self-organized was allow them to select the teams where they think they could help out. So obviously over the years, there were some people who helped out in all those areas. They could do claims work, enrollment, and billing, but there were newer people who had only done claims work, right? So this is just an example of how you can rationalize demand and delivery to bring you more towards a broad product definition. And then I would encourage you, just find something that feels like the right starting point. And you can add political conversations into this. It might have some layers in the hierarchy that would really resist this, so maybe you don't try it right away. But the closer you can get out of the gates to getting your product definition right, or broader, I should say, closer from a consumer standpoint, customer standpoint, the better, the more all the Scrum terminology and the way things work in Scrum are going to make sense and fall into place naturally, because you'll be able to get to a working product increment within the iteration. You'll be able to get your stakeholders' attention because you are showing them working product every iteration. And then the game changer just takes hold. And months later, the organization looks back and wonders, wow, why didn't we do this years ago? How did we ever go down that path of specialization and component teams and multiple lists? So that was one thing I really wanted to share today. I hope that wasn't too much of a selfish part of this, and I'm hoping this brought value to some people. Even if you haven't had a chance to ask your question yet, I hope this maybe answered some of it. But I'm going to shut up now and see if there's any follow-up questions based on that.
So this is kind of tied to it. It's more focused on teams, but I think it's kind of tied to it. So I'm going to take this question next. There's some others that were in the queue, but since it's related. What's your recommendation for organizations having platform or horizontal teams like promotions, notifications, accounting, and so on, that serves all the features delivered by the product, and how would you structure these teams?
So, yeah, this is the nuance conversation, and without the context. So, if we're back to kind of platform capabilities, those could stand on their own. I guess I'll relate it back to what I have drawn here, so I don't have to redraw a whole canvas. I had the luxury of having the CFO in the conversations during this scenario. And one question I ask CFOs, or it can be anybody who has control over budgets, because if you follow the money in an organization, you can uncover a lot. And I would ask yourself, where do you want to optimize for agility? So in those examples that you have these platforms, these capabilities, where do you want to optimize? Throw some scenarios at the wall. What if, in this example, what if the claims work is just extremely high right now? And the enrollment and billing work, if we were to collapse this into one backlog, right, we'd rack and stack this, is actually not that important right now. But we don't have, in our old scenario, look at these teams don't have claims knowledge. I just circled them. You should see it in a second. These teams down here don't have claims knowledge, so they can't really quickly help the claims team out. So we're impeding our agility. We're impeding our ability to respond to change effectively when we have a lot of claims workflow in. So the question I would ask is, where do you want your agility? Do you want your agility sitting above all those platforms? Or do you want specific long-lived investment streams to optimize each one of them? And that's an organizational decision. That's a strategic decision that decision makers in the organization need to make. But it's worth asking that question, because if you do want the ability to change your mind and fluctuate across these specialist areas more often, then you are going to want to probably collapse into one backlog and manage it as one product. And that might mean that across these, it might mean different technologies. It might mean that your team is made up of skill sets that span across different technologies. And that's okay. That just means you're coordinating more often across those skill sets, but the product doesn't care, right? If it takes delivering something with different platforms and tech stacks to get to a working product increment, then that's what it takes.
Yeah, and I think that makes perfect sense, Chad. So I think we have time for one more quick question. Hopefully this is a quick one.
Right.
Do you have any recommendation for small organizations where the product owner and the scrum master are actually the same person? How do you maintain that healthy tension between the two roles, that conflict of interest that certainly can arise?
Yeah, I like so this is any dual role in general, but those key roles, obviously, that's tough. So I've been with teams that have had these dual roles. I've been with teams that have a manager and a product owner, or I've actually been it's been manager, product owner, scrum master, all in one. Now, can it work? It it could. You would need extremely high levels of trust, candor, authenticity with your team if the management is involved. But let's just narrow in, since the question was just product owner and scrum master. Look at the trade-offs you're making. It's very often that a product owner will come through a training class, whether it's a product owner course or another one, and a scrum master will come through, and they'll leave 2 days later realizing, wow, there's way more to my role than I realized. This was really beneficial. And when they realize that, you've convinced them without having to convince them that taking on two roles is too much, right? So the age-old question is product owner a full-time role, or is a scrum master a full-time role? It is. If you're being the best scrum master and product owner you can be in this world, then it's going to be full-time. If you're falling into, if you're doing things that maybe are outside what a professional scrum master or professional product owner would be doing, then yeah, maybe you're making it work. So I don't want that to sound accusatory in any way, but I would really look yourself in the mirror if you're the person asking the question, or if you're talking about another person. Maybe just ask them, how is this working? Like, do you feel like you're neglecting either one, and which one? And is there a way we could help? And then maybe look to try an experiment where they step out of one of the roles for a while. But again, it's just trade-offs. If you are doing both, something will get neglected on the product ownership side, meaning you might be making bad decisions, no decisions, or you might just be an absent product owner. Or on the Scrum Master side, you might just be neglecting big impediments that could really help the team move forward. So it's trade-offs.
And it's so difficult to literally change those hats, if you will. Or maybe it's figuratively. I don't know. In some ways it is literal. But because you are taking pressures, as even the person asking the question brought out, and you get that conflict and that internal conflict. Well, I need to support my team and protect my team. Oh, but the product owner is saying, oh, but wait, I am the product owner. So now do I put undue pressure on the team that shouldn't be put on the team because I'm wearing my product owner hat and not the scrum master hat? And oh, by the way, how does the team know which one I'm wearing at the time? It makes it quite difficult.
The other one I've seen, over and over again, maybe not over and over again, but I've seen before is if the product owner is the problem, but the scrum master is the product owner, and the team, typically if they're not like really good with coaching skills or facilitation, relies on a scrum master to surface some of that conflict if the product owner is an issue. They're one and the same, so you're not going to get that surfaced. And if you don't surface conflict and get it out of your way, then it'll just exist indefinitely until something bigger blows up. So, there is a really good natural tension in all the roles in Scrum. I would encourage everyone, just go out and read that Scrum guide, put it under your pillow, humor me, and read it. Read it when you wake up in the morning with fresh eyes, and just look at those accountabilities across the roles, because there is a really nice built-in tension.
Cool. So I want to be conscious of our time box here. If we can just jump to the next slide, Chad.
Yep,
And I want to say thank you very much. Oop, we've got writing in front of it.
I'm cleared
There
it.
we go. Cool. So, hey, we've got lots of content available, and this is all free. We've got learning paths for Scrum Master, for product owner, for agile leaders. Go check them out. If you just click resources on the Scrum.org website for product owner, for Scrum Master, for agile leader, and soon for development team member, you'll take you to these learning paths, which have lots of videos and blogs and articles, along with other resources to really help you learn and continue on this journey of continuous learning. So next slide. And with that, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to the audience for these excellent questions. Thank you, Chad, for the awesome answers. And stay in touch. Stay in touch with Scrum.org. Lots of ways to follow us. And feel free to reach out to Chad or to Scrum.org with other questions. Thank you and have a good day.
Thanks.